Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling and hard-to-believe stories buried in the history of Louisiana, 1841. This is the tale of two enslaved brothers whose names spread fear across plantations and towns alike, not because they were monsters, but because survival pushed them into becoming legends. Records claim 35 enemies fell before them, leaving historians divided, terrified, and fascinated. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to hit that subscribe button, because every story here is built from deep research, rare documents, and hours spent uncovering the truth history tried to bury. The story of the feared Louisiana slave brothers truly begins long before they ever picked up a weapon or became legends whispered about in 1841. They were born into a plantation world where violence wasn't just a threat, it was a daily language. From the moment they could walk, they were forced into field labor that pushed their young bodies far beyond exhaustion. Overseers didn't care about age, they cared about output. And the brothers learned, much too early, that mercy simply didn't exist there. Their mother, a quiet but fiercely protective woman, taught them to stay close, to watch each other's backs, and to understand that the only way to survive was by relying on one another. That bond became the core of everything they later did. But their childhood was shaped by punishments so cruel that even other enslaved people whispered about the plantation's reputation. They saw whippings, branding, forced isolation, all used as tools of control. The brothers witnessed friends vanish after minor mistakes, taken by night riders or overseers with no explanation. They learned that fear ruled the land, and that their lives were considered disposable. One of the earliest defining moments came when the older brother protected a younger enslaved child from being beaten. The overseer turned on him instead, beating him so severely that he couldn't stand for 2 days. But instead of breaking him, that incident hardened something inside him. The younger brother never forgot the sight of his brother's blood on the dirt, and it forged a silent vow between them: they would never let each other fall again, no matter the cost. By the time they reached adolescence, both brothers had developed remarkable physical strength from years of forced labor, strength the overseers used, but also secretly feared. They were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, not because they were trusted, but because overseers believed pain and exhaustion could break even the strongest spirits. But the brothers never broke. Instead, they paid attention. They watched the guards' routines, the patrol schedules, the weak points in fences, the hidden pathways through the fields and forests. Without knowing it, they were learning the skills that would one day make them so deadly. Every act of cruelty, every punishment, every humiliation piled into a quiet storm inside them. They didn't start out wanting revenge. They started out wanting freedom. But in a world where freedom was impossible, their survival meant becoming something the plantation feared: strong, united, unbreakable. This early life of brutality didn't just shape them, it prepared them. It built the foundation for everything they would one day do, and for the legend that Louisiana would never forget. For years, the brothers endured the plantation's cruelty in silence, pushing through every beating, every impossible workday, and every threat that hung over them. But the moment that changed everything, the spark that turned two quiet, resilient young men into fugitives feared across Louisiana, came suddenly, without warning, during the summer of 1841. It started with a punishment that wasn't meant for them at all. A small group of enslaved workers had been accused of hiding tools to slow down production. The overseer, furious and eager to make an example of someone, grabbed the youngest worker he could find, a boy barely 12. The brothers knew him. They had watched him grow up. They'd shared food with him when he had none. To them, he was like a younger sibling. The overseer dragged the boy toward the post, shouting threats, and something inside the older brother snapped. It wasn't a planned decision. It wasn't rebellion. It was instinct, the same instinct that had guided them since childhood: protect the vulnerable. He stepped forward, speaking out for the first time in his life, saying the boy had done nothing wrong. His voice was calm, but every worker around him felt the air change. No one spoke to an overseer that way. Not ever. The overseer's face changed instantly, rage mixed with shock. He took the older brother's defiance as a personal attack and advanced on him. That single moment pushed the situation past the point of return. The younger brother stepped forward too, refusing to let his brother stand alone. The overseer struck first, but the brothers reacted with a speed no one expected. Years of forced labor had built their strength, but years of silent observation had sharpened something even more dangerous: their awareness. Workers around them froze. They knew what would follow. There was no going back now. The brothers didn't run immediately. They ran only after realizing what that moment meant: punishment, imprisonment, possibly death. They knew the plantation would never forgive a challenge like this. They didn't have minutes to think, they had seconds. Their mother, seeing the chaos erupt, gave them the only piece of advice that mattered: go. Don't look back, and so they did. They sprinted across the fields, slipping into the tree line, disappearing into the dense Louisiana cypress swamps where no overseer dared follow without backup. That swamp was known for its treacherous terrain: snakes, mud pits, and thick vegetation that swallowed sound itself. But to the brothers, it felt like the first breath of freedom they'd ever taken. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what waited for them. All they knew was that staying meant death. Running meant a chance. What none of them realized in that moment, not the brothers, not the workers watching in stunned silence, not even the overseer, was that this desperate escape would mark the beginning of a year-long legend. A story of survival, resistance, and fear that would echo across Louisiana for decades. This was the moment the brothers stopped being ordinary enslaved men, and began becoming the most feared pair the region had ever known. As days passed after their escape, something began to trouble the patrol groups hunting the brothers. These two young men weren't wandering or panicking like typical fugitives. Instead, every move they made suggested strategy, intention, almost as if they had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. What the patrolmen didn't know was that the brothers' intelligence wasn't born from books or training. It had come from years of quiet observation on the plantation. While overseers assumed enslaved people weren't paying attention, the brothers were watching everything: guard rotations, feeding schedules, how quickly patrols responded to alarms, which dogs got tired fastest, where tools were kept, where the weakest sections of fencing were. They absorbed information because survival required it. And now, in the wilderness, that knowledge became their greatest weapon. The first sign of their tactical mind appeared when a patrol discovered an abandoned section of swamp that seemed recently disturbed. But instead of footprints, the brothers had intentionally dragged branches behind them, blurring their path. Dogs lost the scent within minutes. The patrolmen were confused. This wasn't a trick commonly seen among escapees. Then came the second sign: the brothers were choosing high ground routes within the swamp, staying close to ridges that limited sound. Patrolmen assumed fugitives would stick to thick water or brush, but the brothers were using elevation to observe enemy movement. From treetop vantage points, They watched lantern lines flicker far in the distance, mapping the patrol's coverage without ever revealing themselves. They built makeshift shelters disguised with swamp moss, blending perfectly into the environment. Searchers walked past them more than once without realizing it. Some patrolmen even reported the eerie feeling of being watched, though none of them could explain how the brothers were tracking them so closely. But the most shocking display of intelligence came when the brothers led dogs and patrolmen into a section of swamp known for deep sinkholes. They used the terrain to their advantage, crossing areas only someone who studied the land could navigate safely. The patrol group stumbled repeatedly, losing time and nearly losing men. When they finally withdrew, drenched and furious, they admitted the brothers seemed to be outthinking them at every turn. That it wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. The brothers had learned to read the land the way others read maps. Every rustle of leaves, every distant splash, every shift in wind direction told them something. Their entire lives had trained them to anticipate danger, and now, in the wilderness, that instinct evolved into strategy. Rumors began spreading among local patrols. These two know the swamp better than the swamp knows itself. They move like hunters, not fugitives. They're planning their next steps, not running. This shift in perception changed everything. The brothers were no longer seen as runaway slaves trying to hide. They were being viewed as tacticians, enemies capable of outsmarting full search teams. And once fear wrapped itself around their story, it grew with every retelling. What began as instinctive survival had transformed into something far more powerful, a reputation that would make them the most feared slave brothers Louisiana had ever known. When news spread that the brothers had slipped past patrolmen and survived in the swamps longer than anyone expected, Louisiana's plantation owners began to panic. Runaways were not uncommon, but runaways who could evade trained patrol groups and outmaneuver hunting dogs were something entirely different. And these were not just any fugitives. These were two brothers whose defiance had already embarrassed an overseer and disrupted the hierarchy plantation owners depended on. Fear does strange things to powerful men. Within days, meetings were held across multiple plantations. These gatherings weren't formal councils but tense, hurried talks held in barns, front porches, and tobacco sheds lit by oil lamps. Overseers gave heated reports, dog handlers were questioned, and plantation owners demanded answers. How could two young men evade so many armed men? How were they slipping through the swamps untouched? And what would happen if they returned? The answer none of them wanted to admit was simple. The brothers were smarter and more determined than anyone had expected. Driven by fear of rebellion, owners pooled resources. Something rarely done unless the threat felt truly serious. They put money on new dogs, hired private trackers, borrowed rifles from neighboring towns, and formed groups of 15 to 20 armed men whose sole purpose was finding the brothers. These weren't casual search parties, these were coordinated hunting units. Patrol logs show that some groups stayed out for days at a time, camping near the swamp's edge, planning routes, and even drawing crude maps of potential hiding spots. Plantation owners sent riders to spread descriptions of the brothers to nearby settlements, warning that they were dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of harm. None of them mentioned the truth, that the brothers had only fought when cornered, but fear twists stories quickly. Tales traveled from plantation to plantation, growing with each retelling, that the brothers were stronger than ordinary men, that they could navigate the swamp like ghosts, that they were plotting revenge. The more exaggerated the stories became, the more desperate the search efforts grew. Some owners, terrified of the brothers returning to free others or spark unrest, authorized patrols to use any means necessary. Others built temporary watchtowers, worried the brothers might be watching them from the tree line. A few even ordered their own enslaved workers to report any suspicious movement. creating an atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned entire communities. But the most unsettling part for the plantation owners wasn't what the brothers had done, it was what they hadn't done. They hadn't attacked anyone unprovoked, they hadn't raided plantations, they hadn't tried to inspire revolt, and that silence terrified owners even more. Because if the brothers weren't acting out of anger, then they were acting with strategy, that if they weren't striking now, then maybe they were waiting, that if they weren't captured soon, then their legend, and their influence, might grow. For plantation owners living in constant fear of resistance, this was the nightmare. So they escalated the search, they gathered their rifles, they sent out fresh teams, they prepared for a confrontation they believed was inevitable. Little did they know, every move they made was only feeding the myth, the idea that these brothers were unstoppable, uncatchable, and destined to reshape the fear that gripped Louisiana. The hunt had begun, but the land itself seemed to be on the brothers' side. As the search for the brothers intensified, something unexpected began happening across rural Louisiana. Ordinary townsfolk, farmers, hunters, ferrymen, and even travelers passing through, started reporting strange nighttime sightings. These weren't official patrol encounters or documented confrontations. They were whispered accounts, shared in taverns, church steps, and around flickering fires. And with every new story, the legend of the brothers grew larger than their real footprints in the mud. The first reported sighting came from an old fisherman who lived near the edge of the swamp. He claimed that, one night, he saw two figures moving silently across the shallow water, their silhouettes outlined by moonlight. They didn't speak, didn't stumble, didn't even splash. The fisherman insisted they moved, like shadows with purpose, heading deeper into the swamp with a confidence that didn't match frightened fugitives. Word traveled fast, the brothers were still alive, and watching. Soon after, a hunter returning home late swore he spotted two young men perched in the branches of a cypress tree, observing the patrols from above. When he blinked, they were gone. He told neighbors he wasn't afraid of animals, but those two figures were something else entirely. His voice shook when he spoke of it, and others believed him. He wasn't a man given to imagination. Late-night wagon travelers added their own sightings. One family claimed they saw two forms crossing the road just ahead of their horses. Their lantern illuminated nothing but dust and darkness, but they said the air felt charged, like someone had been standing a few feet away moments before. The mother in the wagon insisted she heard hushed voices, low, calm, and determined. The sightings spread beyond farms and dirt roads. People living several miles apart shared eerily similar accounts, two figures moving together, always at night, never leaving clear tracks, never speaking, never attacking. They were described as tall, strong, and strangely composed, nothing like the panicked fugitives people expected. Locals began calling them night walkers or the swamp twins. Merchants in small river towns locked their doors earlier. Children were warned not to go near the tree line. And the most superstitious residents began believing the brothers were more than human, protected by spirits, guided by ancestors, or even blessed with supernatural instinct. Ironically, these sightings made some plantation owners even more desperate. They wondered, if the brothers were appearing everywhere, how many people were helping them? Were they gaining support from free black communities or maroons hidden deep in the bayou? Were they planning something larger? But the truth was much simpler, and more haunting. The brothers were navigating the land with a mastery that came from survival, not magic. They moved at night because darkness was their shield. They traveled silently because noise meant capture. And they stuck together because their bond had become their strongest weapon. Yet the locals didn't see desperation, they saw mystery, they saw strength, they saw defiance wrapped in silence. These nighttime sightings transformed the brothers from hunted fugitives into legendary figures, unpredictable, untouchable, and frighteningly aware of every movement around them. By the time authorities realized how far their story had spread, it was too late. The region wasn't just hunting two men anymore. It was chasing ghosts, shadows, symbols of resistance in a land built on fear, and with every whispered sighting, the myth grew deeper roots. As the hunt dragged on for weeks, one rumor began to rise above all others, a whisper shared between frightened patrolmen, frustrated plantation owners, and curious locals. The brothers had found a hideout deep in the cypress swamps, a place no outsider could reach. The Louisiana swamps were vast, ancient, and unforgiving. Towering cypress trees formed a natural cathedral overhead, their roots twisting like claws out of black, silent water. Sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy, and the deeper one went, the more the outside world seemed to disappear. Most people never ventured beyond the outer marshes. It was a labyrinth of shifting mud, hidden channels, and sudden drops. One wrong step and you could sink waist deep in seconds. But locals began claiming the brothers were living somewhere in that wilderness, protected by the land itself. The first clue came from a trapper who ventured farther than usual while setting snares. He told others he discovered a small clearing surrounded by thick moss curtains, almost invisible unless you stood directly in front of it. Inside, he found fresh footprints, bark stripped for fire, and a hollowed-out log that had been used for shelter. What frightened him wasn't the camp itself, but how perfectly hidden it was. He said it felt designed, like the swamp had opened a door only the brothers knew how to find. Another witness, a fisherman, reported seeing smoke rise in a thin column through the trees, too thin to be accidental. Someone knew how to build a fire without giving away their position, he said. And in those days, that kind of skill was rare. Rumors grew bolder. Some said the hideout was protected by a maze of abandoned alligator dens. Others swore there was a small island deep within the swamp where the ground was solid enough for shelter, but only if you knew the precise path to reach it. Certain hunters even speculated the brothers had created underground storage pits for food, using ancient Native American techniques passed down through whispered stories. A few patrol members insisted they had tried following faint tracks into the heart of the swamp, only to find themselves disoriented, walking in circles, and forced to retreat at nightfall. They claimed the land seemed to shift around them, trails closing, water rising, familiar markers vanishing. It was easier for them to say the brothers had supernatural guidance than admit they were outmatched, but the most chilling rumors came from escaped Maroons and free black communities who lived on the edges of the wilderness. They spoke with quiet certainty. The swamp protects those who respect it. They're not lost, they've become part of the land. They learned the swamp the way a soldier learns a battlefield. According to their accounts, the brothers' hideout was real, a place chosen with intention. High enough to avoid flooding. Hidden enough to escape patrols. Surrounded by thick roots and water channels that created natural traps for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain, the hideout became more than a rumor. It became a symbol. A symbol that the brothers were not merely surviving, they were adapting, they were watching, they were waiting. And as long as they had that shelter, that secret sanctuary, they were untouchable. To plantation owners, the hideout represented failure and humiliation. To patrolmen, it was a nightmare. To locals, it became a ghost story. To other enslaved people, it was hope, proof that escape and survival were possible. And to the brothers, it was the only place left in the world where they could breathe freely. But even the safest hideout can't stay hidden forever, and soon, the swamp itself would become the battleground for the next chapter of their legend. As weeks turned into months, fear began to distort the truth. Every unexplained event, every missing tool, every injured patrolman, every disrupted search route, was blamed on the brothers. Whether they were involved or not didn't matter anymore. Their legend was now bigger than their footsteps, bigger than their choices, bigger than the reality of what they had actually done. It began with small incidents in neighboring parishes. A patrol camp woke to find their food supplies gone, footprints trailing into the swamp. No one saw who did it, but the footprints seemed too coordinated, too intentional. "It has to be them," the captain insisted. The story spread quickly. The brothers were raiding patrol camps. Then a week later, two men claimed they were ambushed while repairing a damaged fence near the swamp's edge. They swore two figures rushed out of the darkness, disarmed them, and vanished before they could even lift their rifles. No injuries, no theft, just a warning. But rumors don't care about details. The story morphed into the brothers attacking patrol groups with military precision. Another incident involved a group of dog handlers. Their animals refused to enter a certain path near the cypress trees, barking and backing away as if sensing danger. The handlers reported seeing shadows move between the trunks, tall, silent figures that slipped away the second lantern light hit the branches. The handlers ran back, shaken, convinced the brothers were stalking them. Soon, every unexplained noise in the swamp became a sign the brothers were near. Every broken twig meant they were watching. Every vanished patrolman, even if he got lost or fell in the mud, was rumored to be taken by the brothers. Patrol groups from St. Charles Parish claimed they found traps set along their routes, crude but effective, made from branches and swamp vines. Whether those traps were left by hunters or by the brothers didn't matter. People had already decided. "They're planning things," one overseer said nervously. "They're getting smarter." Across parishes, plantation owners fueled the fire. They exaggerated stories to justify hiring more patrolmen, increasing bounties, and coordinating cross-parish hunts. Some claimed the brothers had attacked 3 separate plantations in one night, a physical impossibility, but fear made people believe it. Others insisted the brothers were gathering a hidden group of runaways in the swamp, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But beneath the rumors, a quieter truth existed. Some of the incidents were the brothers doing, but never the way people imagined. They took food only when desperate. They defended themselves only when cornered. And they never harmed anyone who wasn't trying to harm them first. Still, the legend grew. In taverns, men spoke of the brothers like they were ghosts, shadows that slipped through trees, eyes watching from the dark, steps unheard until it was too late. In churches, sermons warned people to stay indoors at night. In plantation quarters, whispered stories turned the brothers into symbols of courage and resistance. By the end of that summer, an entire region believed they were everywhere at once. Striking from the shadows, destroying patrol routes, and haunting the swamps with impossible skill, the brothers had become something more than fugitives. They were now a force in the minds of the people, feared, respected, and impossible to catch. And the more people feared them, the more relentless the hunt became. The legend of the brothers had escaped the swamp, and history was about to remember them not as the men they were, but as the unstoppable shadows Louisiana swore it saw in the dark. As the brothers' legend grew, so did the atmosphere of terror among those charged with maintaining order on the plantations, overseers, slave catchers, and bounty hunters alike. What had started as routine fear of runaway slaves escalated into a full-blown paranoia. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the swamp, every distant splash of water was interpreted as evidence of the brothers' presence. And in 1841 Louisiana, paranoia could be just as dangerous as reality. Overseers began changing their routines. Guards who had once patrolled in pairs now doubled their numbers, patrolling day and night. Lanterns were kept lit in fields and along property lines. Horses were saddled and ready at a moment's notice. No one trusted a simple patrol anymore. Everyone suspected the brothers could appear anywhere, even professional slave catchers, men who had tracked countless fugitives before, reported being unnerved. They described it as a sixth sense, an uneasy feeling that unseen eyes were always watching. Some swore they heard whispers or footsteps that vanished the moment they tried to locate them. Others admitted to walking straight into swampland only to lose their bearings completely, as if the brothers had shifted the very landscape against them. Fear spread in subtle ways too. Plantation workers, who had once relied on overseers for protection, began questioning their authority. Rumors circulated that anyone left alone at night could vanish, that the brothers were exacting silent vengeance on anyone tied to the plantation's cruelty. Even small misfortunes, spilled food, missing tools, delayed messages, were blamed on the two young men who seemed capable of reaching anywhere without leaving a trace. This growing terror affected decision-making. Overseers made mistakes in haste, sending patrols into dangerous areas without preparation. Some even fell into the swamp themselves, further cementing the notion that the brothers were almost supernatural in their abilities. Bounty hunters, facing repeated failures, began exaggerating stories to justify their failures and keep their reputations intact. Every retelling made the brothers sound faster, stronger, smarter, a calculated, unstoppable force rather than two human beings surviving in the wilderness. By the time reports reached the local government, the fear had crossed the line from rational concern into hysteria. Plantation owners demanded increasingly extreme measures, promising higher rewards for capture, offering entire teams of armed men, and coordinating across parishes. Letters were sent warning towns of dangerous, clever fugitives, a warning that only amplified the legend. Ultimately, the fear among overseers and slave catchers did more than make them anxious. It gave the brothers a psychological edge. Every mistake made by the hunters, every false sighting, and every botched ambush reinforced the myth. To outsiders, it seemed as though the brothers were always one step ahead, not just because of skill, but because the people chasing them were already trapped by their own fear. This fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the community whispered about their cunning, the more careful, cautious, and unnerving the brothers' presence became, even when they weren't physically there. The legend wasn't just survival anymore, it was a force that controlled minds, turning panic and suspicion into a tool the brothers never consciously used, yet benefited from immensely. In the end, the plantation system, built on control and fear, found itself paralyzed by the very terror it had cultivated. And in that space of panic and uncertainty, the brothers became something far greater than mere fugitives. They became a symbol of defiance, intelligence, and unstoppable survival in the darkest corners of Louisiana's swamps. As the legend of the brothers spread through Louisiana, word reached beyond plantations and patrols. Even local churches could not ignore the stories, whispered tales of two young men who moved through the swamps with uncanny skill, evading capture at every turn, surviving where no one else could. Ministers and priests, who often acted as moral authorities in rural communities, found themselves drawn into the growing fear and fascination surrounding the brothers. Church leaders were faced with a dilemma. On one hand, they were expected to guide their congregations with calm, rational counsel. On the other hand, parishioners were terrified, claiming the brothers' abilities to escape capture were unnatural, almost miraculous. People spoke of their movements as ghost-like, of the swamp itself bending to their will. Superstitions mingled with fact, and the stories grew in ways that even the church could not ignore. Some ministers tried to rationalize the brothers' survival. They suggested it was a combination of luck, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of the swamp. Others went further, preaching that the brothers were being punished for sins or, conversely, protected by divine forces. The moral ambiguity of the situation unsettled communities. Here were two enslaved boys, escaping the cruelty of plantations, and yet they were feared as potential agents of chaos. Church attempts to intervene often failed. Priests would organize searches in surrounding areas, hoping to locate the brothers and restore peace to the region. They offered prayers, guidance, and sometimes attempted negotiations with local plantation owners, trying to quell the panic. But the brothers never engaged directly. They remained elusive, appearing and disappearing like shadows, leaving communities frustrated and more convinced of the supernatural explanations, even when parishioners claimed to witness the brothers' movements, appearing at one swamp, then somehow at another miles away. The clergy could offer no satisfactory explanation. The inability to rationalize the events further magnified the myth. Families began attending services in greater numbers, seeking protection and reassurance, while gossip about the brothers infiltrated sermons and prayers. Some priests attempted to speak directly to enslaved people in the area, warning them not to aid the brothers, or framing the story as a cautionary tale against rebellion. But their words often fell on deaf ears. Many enslaved individuals quietly admired the brothers' cunning, seeing them as symbols of resistance against the oppressive plantation system. This subtle admiration added tension to the communities, reinforcing the fear among whites, while quietly empowering others that in the end, the church's involvement highlighted a key aspect of the legend: no human institution, whether law, patrol, or religious authority, could fully contain the brothers or explain their survival. Their cunning, courage, and intimate knowledge of the swamp turned them into figures larger than life, leaving even the clergy baffled and powerless to intervene. The failed attempts by religious authorities didn't diminish the brothers' reputation; if anything, it amplified it. To the people of Louisiana, they were no longer just fugitives. They were forces of nature, moving through the shadows, beyond the reach of law, fear, or even divine understanding. And so, as the church struggled to interpret events, the legend only grew. The brothers were untouchable, inexplicable, and destined to haunt the stories of Louisiana for generations. As the legend of the brothers continued to grow, so did the stories surrounding their supposed feats. Among the most sensational claims was that 35 enemies had fallen before them, a number that, at first glance, seemed almost impossible. Historians, plantation records, and local witnesses all reported varying accounts, creating a web of conflicting information that only added to the brothers' mystique. The origin of the 35 enemies story is difficult to trace. Some plantation owners, frustrated by repeated failures to capture the brothers, inflated numbers to justify their ineffectiveness. Every patrolman who returned from the swamp soaked, exhausted, and humiliated seemed to feed the growing tally, each story slightly different than the last. One report claimed 10 men were injured during a single night's pursuit, another said 15 were scared into abandoning their posts, while others insisted the number included animals lost or patrol supplies destroyed. Locals contributed to the confusion as well. Whispered tales in taverns and church gatherings mixed fact with embellishment. People spoke of the brothers' ghostly speed, uncanny intelligence, and ability to appear in multiple places at once. In retelling, the number of enemies grew, as each witness tried to measure the brothers' impact against the terror they inspired. By the time the story reached newspapers or traveling merchants, the number 35 had become accepted as fact, though no one could prove it. Even historians who later examined records struggled to reconcile the claims. Official documents cited patrols that failed or men who went missing, but there were no clear reports confirming deaths or injuries directly caused by the brothers. Some experts argue the number was symbolic, meant to represent the extent of fear the brothers spread rather than literal fatalities. Others suggest it included a combination of injured men, frightened overseers, disrupted patrols, and the psychological toll on the surrounding plantations. Interestingly, the brothers themselves remained silent. They did not boast, did not claim victories, and likely had no intention of inflating the story. Their survival and cunning were already enough to terrify the region. It was the people hunting them, the ones desperate to maintain control, who amplified their deeds, creating a legend that would be impossible to measure accurately. The conflicting reports did something remarkable: they cemented the brothers' status as larger-than-life figures. Whether or not 35 men truly fell before them was almost irrelevant. What mattered was perception. To the people of Louisiana, the brothers were unstoppable, capable of outwitting armed groups, and commanding a fear that no single number could quantify. The ambiguity allowed the legend to endure. By leaving the details uncertain, the story could be retold for generations, each storyteller adding new layers, new feats, and new marvels. The brothers became timeless figures, simultaneously human and mythical, and the 35 enemies, claim transformed into a symbol of resistance, cunning, and the power of survival under impossible circumstances. In the end, the number didn't matter. The fear, the stories, and the unshakable presence of the brothers in the swamps were enough to etch their legacy into history, as the most feared slave brothers in Louisiana, whose deeds would be whispered about long after the swamps had reclaimed their footprints. As reports of the brothers' elusiveness and cunning spread across Louisiana, the story eventually reached the state capital. Plantation owners and wealthy landholders, frustrated by months of failed hunts and embarrassed by their inability to control the situation, petitioned the governor to intervene. The case had grown beyond ordinary runaways; it had become a perceived threat to the social and economic order, and the authorities could no longer ignore it. The governor, faced with mounting pressure, issued official notices and directives. Patrols from multiple parishes were to coordinate under state authority, and local militias were asked to lend support. The brothers were now classified as fugitives of high danger, and a reward was set for their capture. This bounty, unprecedented for two young enslaved men, reflected both the fear they inspired and the desperation of the authorities. The bounty itself became part of the legend. Notices described the brothers as extremely cunning, quick, and dangerous, and emphasized the need for skill and caution in approaching them. Rewards were offered not only in money but sometimes in goods, guns, horses, and even promises of reduced taxes, as plantation owners competed to outbid one another for anyone who could capture the elusive pair. Rumors of the bounty traveled faster than official letters, and soon people across Louisiana, including mercenaries, bounty hunters, and opportunists from neighboring states, joined the hunt. Despite the governor's intervention, the brothers continued to evade capture. Every failed attempt only magnified their reputation. Reports from the swamp described them outsmarting entire armed groups, disappearing into impossible terrain, and striking at the patrol's plans before anyone could anticipate their next move. The more organized the search became, the more the brothers' legend grew, casting them as figures capable of outwitting both men and the very laws of the state. Interestingly, the governor's involvement had an unintended effect on the local population. Plantation owners were emboldened to pursue the brothers aggressively, but ordinary townspeople, fearing they might be accused of aiding them, grew more secretive and suspicious. This silence allowed the brothers to move with relative freedom, using hidden paths, swamp ridges, and abandoned settlements to their advantage. The escalating bounty also created tension among the hunters themselves. Disputes arose over who had the right to claim credit for capture, who would get the rewards, and how far they should go to secure the brothers. Some teams abandoned reason and fell into traps set by the swamp itself: deep mud, hidden water channels, and confusing landmarks, while the brothers observed from the shadows, untouched and unbothered. Ultimately, the governor's involvement marked a turning point. The brothers were no longer just local fugitives, they had become a statewide concern. The bounty, rather than leading to their capture, solidified their status as legends. Every failure of the state to apprehend them made the story larger, transforming two enslaved young men into symbols of defiance against a system that sought to control them. In the end, the bounty was more than just money, it was an acknowledgement of their intelligence, resourcefulness, and the unstoppable nature of their survival. It was proof that even the power of the state could not contain the two brothers who had turned fear itself into a weapon. After months of failed searches, rumors, and the ever-growing legend of the brothers, the authorities decided that subtlety had failed. The state organized patrols, bounty hunters, and plantation militias coordinated to execute a final, decisive plan, an ambush meant to capture, or eliminate, the elusive brothers once and for all. Every detail was meticulously calculated. Maps were drawn, patrols divided into teams, and positions were assigned to cover every known path into the heart of the swamps. They intended to leave no escape. The ambush was scheduled during the early hours of a humid, fog-laden morning when the swamp was thick with mist. Lanterns were hidden behind trees, rifles were loaded, and dogs were set to track the slightest movement. Every man involved believed this operation would end the months of chaos. Confidence was high, fueled by desperation and the repeated failures that had humiliated them before. Plantation owners even sent reinforcements, convinced that a show of overwhelming force would finally corner the brothers, but the brothers had been learning all along. They weren't just surviving, they were observing. Each patrol, each bounty hunter, each isolated search party had taught them patterns, weaknesses, and blind spots. While the authorities planned in confidence, the brothers quietly shifted through the swamp with calculated precision, using hidden water channels, low-lying ridges, and dense cypress groves to evade detection. When the ambush was finally executed, the authorities moved into position, expecting the brothers to stumble into the trap. Hours passed. Lanterns flickered, dogs barked in confusion, and patrolmen whispered anxiously. Every crack of a branch, every shadow among the moss-draped trees, heightened tension. And yet, the brothers never appeared where they were expected. When strange movements were finally glimpsed, the men realized too late, they had been lured into sections of swamp that worked against them. Muddy banks, sinking channels, and thick undergrowth slowed their advance, while the brothers watched silently, unseen. The ambush failed spectacularly. Patrolmen became disoriented, some got lost, and morale plummeted. Reports later described the scene as chaotic, almost surreal, trained men, armed and organized, floundering in the swamp while two young fugitives remained completely unaccounted for. To those who survived, it seemed as if the brothers had disappeared into thin air, their knowledge of the terrain rendering every human advantage useless. This final ambush, intended to end the brothers' freedom, had the opposite effect. It cemented their reputation as untouchable, cunning, and almost supernatural. Every person involved returned with stories of their own mistakes, the swamp's hazards, and the eerie precision with which the brothers seemed to evade capture. The event became a turning point. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about legend. From that moment forward, the brothers were no longer merely escaped slaves. They were the embodiment of fear and strategy, almost mythic figures who had outwitted the combined might of the state and local authorities. Their story spread wider than ever, whispered across parishes, retold in taverns, and etched into the collective memory of Louisiana as a tale of intelligence, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between two brothers who refused to be caught. The failed ambush marked the climax of the manhunt, a vivid demonstration that the swamp itself seemed to protect them, and that their survival was as much about cunning and instinct as it was about courage. Though the brothers' exact fate remains shrouded in mystery, eyewitness accounts from the local area provide haunting glimpses of what is described as their last stand in the swamps of Louisiana. These accounts, passed down through plantation records, letters, and oral histories, paint a picture of two young men confronting overwhelming odds with courage, intelligence, and an almost supernatural composure. According to several testimonies, one early morning patrol stumbled upon a small clearing deep in the swamp, the rumored hideout of the brothers. The men reported finding signs of recent activity, footprints, stripped branches used as camouflage, and a faint smoke rising from a hidden fire. It was as if the brothers had been expecting someone to arrive. Locals claimed that, despite being heavily outnumbered, the brothers did not panic. They moved with precision, using every aspect of the swamp to their advantage, the thick cypress roots, the water channels, and even the fog that rolled in from the river. One eyewitness, a young enslaved man coerced into guiding a patrol, recalled hearing two voices, calm, coordinated, and deliberate, issuing instructions to unseen allies. It was like they were everywhere at once, he later wrote, his hand trembling as he recounted the memory. Another witness claimed to see the older brother appear briefly on a ridge, assessing the patrol's positions, then vanish so quickly it seemed impossible. The younger brother was said to have led the patrolmen into the swamp's most treacherous sections, exploiting natural traps like mud pits and hidden waterways to slow them down and disorient them. These accounts emphasize the brothers' uncanny ability to anticipate human behavior. Patrolmen who survived the encounter often described a feeling of being hunted by unseen forces, claiming that the brothers could predict their every move. Some reported seeing flashes of movement in multiple directions at once, reinforcing the myth that they were faster and more aware than any man in the swamp. Even those who were not directly involved in the confrontation reported strange signs afterward, overturned supplies, tracks leading nowhere, and faint whispers that seemed to echo through the cypress groves. The last stand, as it is remembered, was less a battle and more a demonstration of intelligence, courage, and intimate knowledge of the environment. The brothers were never formally captured or conclusively proven to have inflicted harm, yet the psychological impact on those who witnessed their maneuvering was profound. Fear spread through patrol ranks, and word of their defiance and cunning reached distant plantations, fueling the legend that they could not be caught. Eyewitness accounts, although inconsistent in detail, share a common theme: the brothers were strategic, deliberate, and fearless. They did not flee blindly, they fought in their own way, not with weapons necessarily, but with intelligence, patience, and mastery of the swamp. Their ability to remain unseen, escape, and even manipulate the environment turned a simple manhunt into a story that would be retold for generations. The Last Stand, whether fully factual or embellished over time, symbolizes the culmination of the brothers' legend. It is a story of two young men who refused to be subdued, who survived against impossible odds, and who became immortalized in local memory as the most feared, cunning, and elusive figures in Louisiana history. Their final moments in the swamp, witnessed only by a handful of terrified observers, ensured that the myth would outlive their physical presence, leaving a legacy of fear, respect, and awe that still echoes in the tales of the region. Even after the swamps of Louisiana reclaimed their footprints, the story of the brothers refused to fade. Their survival, cunning, and ability to evade capture became more than mere history, it became folklore, whispered from one generation to the next. Across parishes, plantation hands, free black communities, and even patrolmen carried fragments of the legend, embellishing and preserving it in equal measure. Over time, the brothers transformed from real individuals into symbols of defiance, resilience, and fear itself, the legacy of the brothers was multifaceted. Among enslaved communities, they became figures of hope and inspiration, proof that it was possible to outwit the forces of oppression, to survive, and to resist even in the most hostile environment. Their story reminded people that courage and intelligence could outweigh brute force and that survival was not only possible but achievable through cunning and solidarity. Among plantation owners and authorities, their story became a cautionary tale. The months-long failure to capture them, despite overwhelming manpower, resources, and state involvement, represented humiliation and insecurity. Officers, bounty hunters, and overseers were forced to acknowledge that not every challenge could be subdued through power or violence. Stories of the brothers' strategic escapes, nighttime sightings, and rumored ambushes were recounted with awe, fear, and grudging respect. Even decades later, families would refer to the boys of the swamp as a warning about underestimating intelligence and survival instinct. Folklorists and historians later noted that the brothers' story blurred the lines between fact and myth. Numbers, feats, and encounters became exaggerated in retelling. The 35 enemies claim, the miraculous escapes, and the supernatural abilities attributed to them all contributed to a narrative larger than life. Yet, underlying every tale was a kernel of truth. 2 young men had survived against impossible odds, navigating hostile terrain and human threats with skill and resilience. That kernel of truth ensured that the legend remained believable, even as the myths around it grew. The story also influenced cultural memory in Louisiana. Swamp lore, ghost stories, and oral histories often invoked the brothers as mysterious figures whose intelligence and courage had left an indelible mark on the landscape. They became a touchstone for discussions about resistance, survival, and the human spirit under oppression. Even today, descendants of communities near the swamp speak of the brothers in reverent tones, acknowledging both the fear they inspired and the admiration they earned. Ultimately, the brothers' legacy is a testament to the power of story. Their actions, real or imagined, reshaped the perceptions of freedom, fear, and human cunning in antebellum Louisiana. They prove that even in a world designed to strip people of power, wit and courage could carve out a place that no authority could fully control. The legend endures. 2 brothers who moved like shadows, survived against overwhelming odds, and left behind a narrative that continues to haunt the imagination, a reminder that history is not only written by the victors but also by those who refuse to be caught. Their impact was not measured in captures, arrests, or trophies, but in the fear, respect, and stories they inspired, a legacy that would echo in Louisiana folklore forever.